Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to study together the fourth type of sentences, compound complex sentences. If you remember, we studied in previous sessions, simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences. Today, we are going to see together compound complex sentences. Let's first identify the definition of compound complex sentences. What's a compound complex sentence? As the name suggests, a compound complex sentence brings both of these sentence forms together, compound and complex sentence. We have to put into our mind, my lovely students, that any compound complex sentence should contain at least two independent clauses. Independent clause, of course, you remember the compound sentences, and at least one dependent clause. So it can be two or more, no problem. And dependent clause, of course, you remember like complex sentences. I think the examples will help us to understand more and more about compound complex sentences and how it brings both of these sentence forms together. Look at the first example here. While Tom reads novels, Jack reads comics, but Sam reads only magazines. Here we have three clauses. The first clause, while Tom reads novels. The second clause, Jack reads comics. The third clause, Sam reads only magazines. The first clause, while Tom reads novels, if I ask you what type of clause is it? Oh, very good, students, very good. It's dependent clause. Can you tell me why? Oh, very good, because it starts with a subordinating connector, while. The second clause, Jack reads comics. What type of clause is it? Oh, it's independent clause. Why? Because it can stand alone as a complete sentence. It has subject, verb, and expresses a full meaning. The third one, Sam reads only magazines. It's another independent clause. It has subject, Sam, verb, reads, and it expresses full meaning. So here we have three clauses, two independent and one dependent. Here in this example, we started with the dependent clause. So if we started with the dependent clause, please don't forget to use a comma after you finish your dependent clause, like the comma here after novels. And for the connector but, we have to use also a comma before it. When we connect the two independent clauses with a coordinating connector like but, after the first independent clause, I use a comma. Let's look at the second example. Tom reads novels, comma, but Jack reads comics because books are too difficult. Here also we have three clauses, two independent clauses, one dependent clause. The first one, Tom reads novels. Tom is the subject, read is the verb, and the clause expresses a full meaning, a complete idea. So this is an independent clause. Jack reads comics. Jack is the subject, reads the verb, and it expresses a complete idea. So this is another independent clause. Independent clause, when I try to connect it with another independent clause by using a coordinating connector, which is but here, I have to use a comma after the first independent clause. And we call this form compound sentences. The last clause here, because books are too difficult. Here, we have subject, we have verb, the subject is books, the verb is are. This clause starts with a subordinating connector because, so actually the idea is not complete, it's dependent clause. If you use a dependent clause at the end of the compound complex sentence, don't use a comma. So before because, don't use a comma, because it's used here between independent and the dependent clause. The third example of a compound complex sentence: Jack, who reads comics, rarely reads novels. However, Tom enjoys novels. Here we have three clauses. Very good, students. What is the first clause? Who can identify it? Oh, very good. Jack rarely reads novels. Jack is the subject, reads is the verb. Very good. And the idea is complete. And here between the two commas, we have a relative pronoun who reads comics. This is dependent clause. It contains a relative pronoun and a verb. The last sentence, Tom enjoys novels. This is another independent clause. We have the subject Tom, verb enjoy, and the idea is complete. Here, when you use a relative sentence, a relative clause like who reads comics, after the subject Jack and before the verbs reads, you can use the two commas, one after the subject Jack and one after comics. And here we use the conjunctive adverb. However, this conjunctive adverb, I should use a comma after it and semicolon before. Please, you have to put these important punctuation marks to make your writing academically correct. So again, for the relative clause, when I use it after the subject and before the verb, I put it between two commas. When I use a conjunctive adverb like however, I use semicolon before and comma after. The last example, people who read comics rarely read novels. Semicolon, they often find books difficult. If I ask you about the dependent and the independent clauses in this example, I'm sure that you will say the first independent clause is people rarely read novels. Very good. And the second independent clause, they often find books difficult. So where is the dependent clause? Very good. The dependent clause here is the relative clause who read comics. You are going to ask me an important question. Why here we haven't used commas? It depends on the context. If you think that the relative clause is necessary and important, you use it without commas. But if they are just extra or additional piece of information, you use commas. So for the previous example, Jack, who reads comics, rarely reads novels. Here, it's just an extra piece of information. It's an additional piece of information. So here, there is no need, here you can actually use it with the two commas. But if the piece of information is necessary, it's important, it's relevant to the context, you have to use it without commas. So again, by the end of our session today, I just want to remind you that in the compound complex sentence, we should have at least two independent clauses and at least one independent clause. For the punctuation rules, I have explained in detail. Don't forget to view this YouTube video more than once, because actually compound complex sentence is one of the most sophisticated structure of sentences. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.